Hello everybody, my name is Colin Mark and I'm the Undersecretary General for Finance of HMUN India, as well as the Director of the First Committee of the General Assembly, Disarmament and International Security, often known as DISEC. I'm creating this video because my webinar on how to succeed in the General Assembly had a lot of technical difficulties, and I know that the recording of that webinar is currently available but isn't very clear or useful to delegates who didn't attend the webinar and weren't able to see the accompanying chat that I used when the audio and the video were not cooperating. So I'm creating a lecture-style video that I'm disseminating to talk about how to succeed in the General Assembly for those of you who missed the webinar, or for those of you who want a clearer version of the information that was presented during the webinar. A bit about myself. I'm a 6-year veteran of the Model United Nations General Assembly. I have competed as a delegate in Model UN committees 24 times with a specialty in the General Assembly, and I've been on dais 5 times, not including for HMUN India, where again I will be directing DISEC, which is the committee that I directed at HMUN Boston earlier this year. So I hope that this video will be informative to you, and I'm very excited to talk about the General Assembly again for the second time today. If you have any questions about anything in this video or about your committee, if it's a General Assembly committee, and particularly if you have any questions about DISEC and you're on my committee, please email me at disec, D-I-S-E-C, at hmunindia.org. Okay, so what are the General Assembly committees at HMUN India? The General Assembly committees are our 5 largest committees that include 195 delegates. And with the exception of the Rajya Sabha, which is an exception to this rule, there are simulations of the United Nations General Assembly, which is the body of the United Nations that contains all 193 members plus 2 observers of the United Nations. So this is the forum in which all of the countries of the world get to express their opinions and be treated equally with one nation, one vote. There are no special privileges for larger, richer, more powerful countries in the General Assembly, and it's, in that sense, very democratic. So every one of you, regardless of the country you're representing, has a more or less equal opportunity to get your views heard and adopted by the General Assembly, particularly under the expectations of Model United Nations. In the Rajya Sabha, all of that is still generally the sense, except that instead of representing countries, you're going to be representing members of the Rajya Sabha. But everything I say in terms of how the committee will flow can be easily adopted to your committee. I'm going to talk about countries because it's more relevant to most of the other delegates, but you can infer that anything I say about countries also applies to the individuals that you're representing in your committee. The size of the General Assembly is really what I think sets it apart from other forms of committee, because so much of what you need to do to maximize your time in the General Assembly involves taking advantage of the many other delegates that are in committee with you, and you cannot get the most out of the General Assembly trying to go it alone and view yourself as one person who is just waiting for their opportunity to speak to the body. Because with the sheer number of delegates in a General Assembly committee, if you only think about the committee in terms of when you get to speak and present your research to the dais, you're really going to be thinking about a 4-day conference in terms of 4 minutes. And if you do the math out in terms of the speaking time that you can expect at HMUN India, which will hover around 1 minute, give or take 30 seconds, you could understand that with 195 delegates over the number of hours of committee we have, that's about what it will work out to once you subtract all of the non-speaking portions of the committee. So the point of this video is to help delegates understand what they're supposed to be doing for the 4 minutes that they're not speaking, and then get a better sense of the kinds of speeches that will help them work in conjunction with the other kinds of debate they're expected to do at HMUN India in the General Assembly. I'm going to break this presentation down into 3 sections. The first section is going to be catered toward beginners, and the goal there is get up to speed on how you should operate in the General Assembly to have the best possible experience, and how to understand what you're going to be expected to do during the General Assembly, get a flavor for the feel of the debate flow. And my hope is that by the end of that section, you will feel confident enough to attend HMUN India and participate fully in the debate in the committee. The second section will be about how to win awards in the General Assembly, and it's going to be geared primarily towards moderate to advanced delegates who are seriously thinking about contending for awards in the General Assembly. And of course, if this is your first time, this information will still be relevant to you, but I'm primarily gearing this towards delegates who feel confident with their understanding of the first section of the presentation, which is on how to feel comfortable in the General Assembly point blank. Then finally, I'm going to move on to a third section that is about how the dais will differentiate between the best delegates in the committee. So this is geared towards the most advanced listeners to this presentation, and this is effectively how do we decide between strong delegates for the highest honors at HMUN India in the General Assembly. In terms of general takeaways that you should expect before I start the presentation, just to quickly summarize what you can realistically expect, the biggest thing to think about in the General Assembly is that your goal is to represent the interests of your country or your individual in a way that allows you to become the a member of a coalition that passes a document through the committee, gets a majority of the committee to support a compromise document that favors the interests to the extent that is possible to get that kind of compromise of your country. And there are exceptions to this rule. Some countries will have policies in certain committees that will never be popular enough to get a majority, and it's more important that you stick to those policies than it is that you compromise to get a majority. But the point is that your goal in the General Assembly is not to be so rigid in your country's policies that you debate against 194 other people, but to present the ideas of your delegation in such a way that you can find ways to build a consensus with enough other countries to be able to get something passed by the body that favors your country in a vote. This might be different from what you have been led to believe is the expectation of the General Assembly, but this is very much what we're focused on. And you'll see more of how that plays out when I talk you through the structure of the committee. So I'm going to begin with the beginner section, and I'm going to talk about the breakdown of the General Assembly at what you should be expecting at each stage during your time at HMUN India. In the beginning of conference, delegates will arrive and they'll start to file into the conference hall. The conference hall will basically look like a big ballroom with most likely 2 sets of seating with a big aisle down the middle. So several rows and columns on one side, a big aisle, and several rows and columns on the other side, facing a raised platform called the dais, on which the members of the judging committee will sit. And so they'll be your director and your assistant directors who will lead the committee and will judge it. And they are known collectively as the dais, which refers to the thing that they're standing on. There will be a microphone set up in the committee, possibly multiple microphones, and generally when you speak, you'll be asked to approach the microphone and you'll speak to the delegates. An important thing to consider, and I'll talk more about this as I go through this presentation, but I want to bring it up now while I'm talking about the microphone. The point when you go up to make a speech is to speak to the delegates, not to speak to the dais, although part of parliamentary procedure and general expectations of Model UN is that you will acknowledge the dais when you begin your speech. Primarily, you are speaking to your fellow representatives, not to the dais that is conducting the debate. We exist to facilitate your ability to speak to your peers. So committee will begin. Everyone will file into the conference hall, laid out as I said. They'll take their seats. The committee will be called to order, and the first phase of the committee is setting the agenda. Because there's only one topic in every committee, setting the agenda is very much just a formal procedure. And by the way, we have other presentations that are available, including a previous webinar by Pietro Gaglioni and a video called Yes, That Is in Order, that are available on the HMUN India website and our Facebook page to acquaint you with parliamentary procedure, which is the formal way that we run the committee. So I'm not going to talk very much about parliamentary procedure, but there is a specified process through parliamentary procedure for setting the agenda. And once the agenda is set, then we'll move on to the speakers list. The speakers list is the default form of debate at HMUN India. It's perhaps less popular at HMUN India than it is at a number of other conferences you may be familiar with. Our directors tend to prefer the second form of debate I'm going to talk about, and I'll explain why in a second. The speakers list is the most general form of debate, so once we begin the speakers list, delegates who are called up to speak on it, and effectively this is just a list of delegates who raise their placard and are added to the list, your placard being a basically cardstock card with your country name on it or your delegation name on it that you use when you want to be addressed by the dais, that you raise. The speakers list will be how debate is conducted for at least several speakers at the discretion of the director, and then at some point the director will open the floor to points or motions. And again, points or motions are covered in other videos about parliamentary procedure, so if you have questions about parliamentary procedure, you should refer to those videos or to HMUN India's Guide to Delegate Preparation. Someone will motion for a moderated caucus at this point. And a moderated caucus is the kind of debate that is most preferred by your directors at HMUN India. Moderated caucuses are targeted debates on some sub-issue of the topic. So for example, my committee, DISEC, will be discussing national sovereignty and asymmetric warfare. Someone could propose a moderated caucus on the subject that is a subtopic of the broader topic that is the agenda, a moderated caucus on border control. This is a more specific issue, and any final solution to the broader problem will have to address that smaller problem, so it makes sense to have a debate on that smaller problem. And within the context of a moderated caucus, delegates who are called on to speak will be called on to speak to that issue. And your directors will prefer moderated caucuses because it provides for a more targeted form of debate. This is the main way that you can expect to be making speeches at HMUN India. Although the speakers list will be part of it, moderated caucus should be the default in your mind. After a number of moderated caucuses or some time on the speakers list, and this is all during the first committee session, at some point the director will entertain a motion for the third form of debate, which is the unmoderated caucus. The unmoderated caucus is a very important aspect of HMUN India, and I think that there are many conferences, particularly in South Asia, that don't emphasize the unmoderated caucus as much as we do, but it's very important that you treat the unmoderated caucus as not just part of the debate, but as, in my personal opinion, the heart of the General Assembly debate. The unmoderated caucus is when the debate is not regulated by rules by the directors. Delegates are free to stand up from their seats, talk to one another. Basically, the conference hall is open for anyone to speak to one another however they want within the confines of politeness and respect for one another. And this is really your opportunity to form coalitions or voting blocks for short. Basically, the goal of unmoderated caucus is to work with other delegates to team up to be able to pitch your ideas together. So what do I mean by a coalition or a voting block? First of all, before I define what the coalition or the voting block does, I want to talk about the goal that you're ultimately going to be working toward. The point of a General Assembly committee is to pass a General Assembly style resolution based on the United Nations General Assembly resolutions. What this will mean for from the purposes of HMUN India is there will be 2 rounds of debate on written documents that propose solutions to the problem. The first round is the working paper phase, which is basically the draft phase. And your working paper will contain your main proposals for how to solve the problem that is in your background guide. And the working papers will be submitted to the director, and the director will introduce the working papers to the committee. And then the committee will have the opportunity to debate the working papers. And I'll talk about how that falls within the arc of the committee in a second. These working papers will then be improved upon, consolidated, and those will become what are called draft resolutions, which is a bit of a confusing name because these are the final documents. They are draft resolutions in that they're being debated by the United Nations and one of them can be passed and will stop being a draft resolution and will become a full resolution. So draft resolution for the purpose of Model UN is the final document that you will write, and it only stops being a draft if the committee votes for it. But your actual draft of your draft resolution is called a working paper. So returning to the first committee session and the unmoderated caucus, the coalition of countries you're forming are the people that you think that you could work with to write a working paper that would contain ideas that your country could support. And remember that your goal is ultimately to get some package of ideas that your country is okay with passed by a majority vote in the committee. So your working paper is your first stab at that with other countries that you agree with. So say you're in my committee and you're representing Syria, and you're deeply concerned about countries using counterterrorism as a justification for an invasion of your country and an erosion of your national sovereignty. You would have a shared policy with a number of countries that have issues with controlling terrorist activities from their countries. For example, Lebanon, which was a case study in our background guide, and had issues with terrorists that were attacking Israel from Lebanon, with Iran, which sponsors both the terrorists in Lebanon that attack Israel and the Syrian government. So you would look for states that share those general policies. I've named 3 there that could team up, but your goal would be to get a larger coalition than that. And you would put the ideas that you think reflect your country's policies and that you want would, in an ideal world, have the United Nations pass into your working paper. The reason that the unmod is so important is that, as I've mentioned before, because the committees are so large, you get very few opportunities to speak. If you see yourself as trying to debate your country's interests against the interests of 194 other countries, you're barely going to get any opportunity to do that because there are so few opportunities to speak. What you really need to be thinking about when you're competing in the General Assembly committees is creating a team of mutually agreed upon delegations that are all working towards getting the same ideas adopted by the committee. And so instead of seeing other delegates that have close policies to yours as potential competitors that you need to differentiate yourselves from, you see them as teammates who have the same goal of getting the committee to adopt your general set of frameworks. And this will make a committee much more enjoyable and will keep you much more in touch with the committee as a narrative rather than just a sea of different people speaking about different ideas. This is all first committee session. Between the first committee session and the second committee session, delegates will complete their working papers and submit them to the director. Some delegates choose to work between committee sessions on their working papers. That's fine. It's not required. The only expectation is that you'll be doing work for the committee during the time that you're in committee session. But just as a fair warning, delegates often do find that they need more time to write working papers that they think are of sufficiently high quality for HMUN India. and tend to work in the morning before the second committee session. The one thing to keep in mind here is that while it is permitted to work outside of committee sessions while at conference, you are strictly forbidden from starting the process of writing working papers or draft resolutions before you get to HMUN India and start your first committee session. This is known as pre-writing, and it is very much against the rules. The other thing that you need to keep in mind, by the way, is that the contents of your working papers and your draft resolutions need to all be original content. Certainly it should be grounded in your research, but it has to come from you, and it needs to be original writing. Otherwise, you would be violating our plagiarism policies, and that could get you into a lot of trouble. And it could also get your school into a lot of trouble, and it can make it difficult for your school to return to HMUN India in the future. So very important that the contents of your documents are created at conference and are original. By the end of the second committee session, in most committees, you can expect that working papers will be submitted to the dais. In terms of the numbers of working papers, in my committee, when I ran DISEC and HMUN Boston, initially we had 11 groups propose working papers, and when I saw that there were 11 blocks that were working on working papers, I set a strict cap of 6 working papers, and I said that if I received more than 6 working papers at the front of the room, I would use a random number generator to pick 6 randomly. So your director has the discretion on how many working papers they will or will not accept. I believed that 11 blocks was more blocks than there were actually conflicting policies in the committee. And this is an important way to think about how you should approach the committee. I took the stance that there were no more than 6 camps that would have trouble compromising and would be worthy of having their own working paper to present different visions of how to solve the problem. So they're really, in a 195 delegate committee, you can expect that if I said that there were only 6 working papers allowed, that means we're expecting each country to be able to agree pretty closely and to find a compromise working paper proposal with about 30 other countries, give or take. So it is very important that you expect to collaborate at HMUN India. Once working papers are submitted and are approved by the dais, they'll be distributed to the delegates. Delegates will be able to read all of the different working papers and see how different blocks believe the issue would be best solved. And then there will be debate on the working papers. Working papers do not have either sponsors or signatories, which means that there are certain conferences that have lists of what are called sponsors, which usually refers to the authors of a document that does not exist at HMUN India. Signatories are a concept that applies to draft resolutions, and I'll circle back around to how they affect working papers, or rather to the fact that they don't affect working papers when I talk about draft resolutions. But just for the moment, I'll mention that you do not need signatories for a working paper. So the assumption is that working papers reflect the body of the work of the committee as a whole, and they don't belong to anybody. And they should be treated as documents based solely on their ideas, not on any country or individual, in the case of the Rajya Sabha, that is responsible for writing them. Once working papers have been debated, the next phase of the committee will be the consolidation process or the merger process, in which working papers will be whittled down into the final draft resolutions, and then they'll be put into the proper format, which you can find in the Guide to Delegate Preparation. Working papers do not have a strict format, but draft resolutions do. Any draft resolution that is approved by your dais will need to address all of the questions a resolution must answer in the background guide. A working paper doesn't necessarily need to, because there's an expectation that a working paper will eventually be combined with other ideas from other delegates, but the draft resolutions all need to answer every question that is in the background guide under questions a resolution must answer. And draft resolutions cannot be submitted unless they have a certain number of signatories. This is at the director's discretion, but you can expect that it will be 25 signatories in a normal-sized General Assembly to be able to submit a draft resolution. So again, you need close to 30 delegates to be at least on board with the draft resolution. And actually, in the case of draft resolutions, it's important to note that signatories are not the same as authors or sponsors. Signatories are people who believe that the ideas in the draft resolution are worthy of debate, which could also mean they are ideas that should be brought up so that they can be refuted. So a signatory does not necessarily support the draft resolution. But that said, if fewer than 30 people think that your draft resolution is worthy of debate, it'll be very difficult for you to bring it to the floor. In DISEC at HMUN Boston, I set the cap for draft resolutions at 3, which meant that the delegates had to negotiate compromise documents and combine their 6 working papers into 3 draft resolutions, which meant that blocks had to, again, the word is merge, had to join forces around a consolidated set of ideas that is a compromise between the different policies of these 2 different blocks that is then presented as a document that is a compromise that is still reasonably on policy for every delegate, or that every delegate believes that it is reasonably on policy for their country. It is really important that you stay within the policies of your country. I will not look favorably, and your director, if it isn't me, will not look favorably on delegates fundamentally going against the interests of their country unless there's a very strong case for it that the delegate will eventually have to make. So expect that while compromise is important, it needs to be compromise that you believe your country would make. At this point, draft resolutions will be submitted, and then the process is a more formalized version of what we discussed earlier with working papers. Draft resolutions will be debated. They'll be presented formally by some of their signatories because draft resolutions have a greater sense of ownership because there are signatories, whereas working papers have neither sponsors nor signatories. There are no names on a working paper. So some of the signatories will have the opportunity at the chair's discretion. What's at the chair's discretion is the format of the introduction and the number of people who are presenting. And by the way, if this has been confusing, chair, dais, director all mean the same thing. At the chair's discretion, the draft resolutions will be introduced to the body. They will be debated. Delegates will then be able to send amendments which are proposed changes to the draft resolutions. And these have a minimum number of signatories. And then in voting procedure, the amendments and the draft resolutions are debated, voted upon. Your goal at this point is to get the draft resolution that you support passed. Excuse me. Okay. So that's the arc of the General Assembly. And again, the big takeaway for a beginner delegate is that you should not think about yourself as debating against 194 other people. And you should not come in with the expectation that you will have great, well-researched speeches prepared that you are introducing to the committee. And because that will account for about 4 minutes of your conference, and the rest of it will be spent waiting and being bored. And more importantly, and I've seen this happen, the committee will have a flow. And if you've come in with specific speeches prepared that you intend to give over the course of the conference, there's a very good chance that the committee will be talking about something in a moderated caucus that is not relevant to what you have prepared a speech on, and it will be out of order and under the rules of procedure for you to give your speech on that topic because the moderated caucus topic is something different. So it's very important that you stay plugged into the flow of debate and think of yourself as working to find a team of other countries that can support ideas you agree with, and then getting that team to win the quest for a majority of the room. That's a major takeaway for the General Assembly. One thing that I am going to return to that I touched on briefly, and this is the beginning of the bridge between the beginner section of the presentation and the moderate to advanced section of the presentation. When you speak before the committee at HMUN India, and again, I touched on this in a couple other places, but this is the consolidated big pitch on this, on how you should be thinking about your speeches. You are making arguments to your fellow delegates. The dais is not going to be paying attention to how many facts you can present to the committee unless you instrumentalize that research to make an argument that has practical implications for what the United Nations should do. The goal of your committee and the goal of everything you say in committee needs to be getting a resolution passed that favors the interests of your country. And the resolution will take the character of recommendations to the Security Council and requests of different countries. If you can't turn the information you're introducing in your speeches into a case for the way a draft resolution should be written, you're doing it wrong. And it's very important. I think the biggest ideological stepping stone that you need to focus on getting is that your goal is not to persuade the dais. The dais is not judging who makes the best speeches, who is the best researched, who is the most persuasive even. The dais is judging who most effectively persuades the other delegates to move forward with the ideas that that delegation is in favor of. Which means that the goal of the dais is to observe how other delegates respond to you, not to pay specific attention to you and your relationship in debate with the dais. This should be good news for those of you who expected it to be otherwise, because this means that you are being judged based on the work you do for 4 days, not on the work you do for 4 minutes when you have the floor. But it's an important paradigm shift, I think, for many delegates who are coming to HMUN India from other conferences, and it is really the essence of how you succeed and how you maximize your time at HMUN India. In terms of how you can expect to contend for awards, and again, this is now the moderate to intermediate, moderate and intermediate to advanced section of the conversation. I mentioned earlier that your main goal is to be a part of a coalition that is advancing the interests of your country. If you hope to be seriously considered for awards at HMUN India, your goal is not just to be a part of one of those coalitions, but to be the leader. To be the person who is most, or the nation, or the individual representative that is most immediately identified with the package of ideas that that group of countries represents. If someone wants to know what the group of countries that are very pro-sovereignty in DISEC says, if Iran is doing a good job in committee, people will think, oh, I remember Iran making this case very persuasively, and a lot of other countries that I know have this policy have sought to work with Iran and have adopted what they are saying to reflect what Iran is saying. So I'm going to ask Iran about the policies of the pro-sovereignty bloc. If that's something that is clear to the delegates, it will become clear to the dais. It might not be obvious to you that this can be judged. Trust me, it can. It manifests itself in the way delegates talk about one another. When delegates talk about who they're working with and who the sponsors of various working papers are, in that process, they end up making clear who those delegates view as the most important people working on the creation of those documents. The people who are pushing a group of countries to work together and leading the process of getting a certain set of ideas packaged. This does not necessarily mean that these are the people who introduced all of those ideas. And actually, I personally am most interested in delegates who are able to take all of the different ideas that exist in a committee that are compatible and help these delegates find the connections to create a comprehensive plan together, rather than writing the whole thing themselves and persuading other people that they should join with specifically that delegate's ideas. Said more concisely, being a leader in this context doesn't necessarily mean providing all of the ideas, but it does mean bringing the ideas together and showing other delegates how they can sell their ideas as a package. And again, the people who are doing this will demonstrate that they are doing this based on the way other delegates talk about them during speeches, based on how they conduct themselves during unmoderated caucus. And at this point, I'd like to reemphasize, unmoderated caucus is extremely important at HMUN India. And by the way, you're also allowed to do work during formal debate outside in the hall at chair's discretion, which is effectively the equivalent of there being a perpetual unmoderated caucus that exists that will be judged just outside of the committee room, given the constraints of the hotel permitting. But that is certainly how we conducted it at HMUN Boston, and I know that I intend to conduct DISEC that way, but I can't speak for the other General Assembly directors. The person who is clearly responsible for making a working paper come together is the person that the dais will most pay attention to when considering awards. This doesn't always end up being one delegation. For example, at HMUN Boston, there was one block in my committee where there were, depending on the point in the committee, anywhere from 3 to 6 people who seemed to be leading this process of bringing the ideas together. What ultimately happened in that block is that over the course of the committee, by a series of things that I'll talk about in the advanced delegates section of this presentation, those 6 people who were in leadership roles in that one block, which became the biggest block and was the one that got a majority through of the committee to back their resolution, those delegates ended up stratifying, and one person did come out on top, and the person who came out on top of that in that winning coalition ended up being our best delegate at DISEC in HMUN Boston. So it's very important that if you are seriously considering, if you consider yourself to be in serious contention for awards, that you are putting yourself in a position where you are making a positive impact on the way working papers are being created in the committee, and a provable, visible, positive impact that the dais will see, and that other delegates will prove in the way they talk about you. The second thing, I mentioned that when you introduce research in your speeches, it should always be with the goal of persuading other delegates that they want to work with you. You can get very far in terms of standing out to the dais and putting yourself in a leadership position if you're able to make well-researched, well-sourced arguments for why the committee should agree with a specific policy proposal that you become associated with. If, for example, you propose a specific plan and you give that plan a name, and you make the case for why that plan would work. So, for example, at the last conference I was at, which was debating a topic similar to the one that I'm running for DISEC, it was defining and addressing terrorism. I proposed the, let's see if I actually remember what this stood for. Cross-cutting controls on paramilitary actors plan, or C3PO. So it was a very catchy name. It was a Star Wars reference. The 3 C's, PO. Everyone remembered that this was the plan that my delegation had introduced, and I made arguments for why the C3PO plan would work, why it would be an effective way to curb terrorism, and delegates then would continue to talk about the C3PO plan, which showed that I was not only making a speech that was memorable, and delegates knew about my delegation and the ideas I was introducing, but it showed that I was able to influence the flow of the debate, which meant that I was important to the process of the whole committee coming to a decision. Even when delegates disagreed with C3PO, the fact that they got up there and talked about the plan proved that the plan was important enough to merit discussion, and that is something that your dais will notice and will reward you for. So those are the main tips that I have for how to move from a delegate who is participating fully to a delegate who is seriously being considered for awards. This last phase of this presentation will be on how those delegates are differentiated by the dais. And this is the most advanced advice that I can give you without your joining the Harvard Model UN team. And then at that point, I'm giving away company secrets. So the two big things that you should keep in mind are the merger process that I mentioned earlier, the process whereby working papers become draft resolutions by consolidating blocks and combining documents, and the strength of the coalition that you assemble. So I'm assuming at this point that you have managed to take the advice that I gave in the most recent section and you are a leader of a working paper to at least some degree, where it is clear that people who know about the ideas of this working paper would immediately associate your delegation with it and would come to you to ask about what your coalition thinks. Excuse me. At this stage, you are now entering the process where you need to merge with other delegations. This could either be in the main merger process where working papers become draft resolutions, or earlier. As I mentioned at HMUN Boston on DISEC, there were 11 working papers in development, and I insisted that that be merged down to 6 before I would entertain the introduction of working papers. So those were also mergers. And a merger, again, is basically where you have two different coalitions with their own set of leaders that have worked on getting the documents that each of these coalitions is proposing created. And these two coalitions know that they need to combine into a larger coalition. But of course, if one person is leading one block and another person is leading another block, they both can't be the one leader of the merged block. Either the two coalitions will have to find a way to operate with two or more leaders in charge, with the leadership of one block and the leadership of the other block coming to some way of both being able to be leaders of the new merged block, or one of the leaders will prove to be better equipped to lead the merged document, or several of the leaders will prove themselves better equipped to lead the merged document. This, by the way, is not only the opportunity for different leaders within the committee who are in different blocks to differentiate themselves from each other. It is also the opportunity for delegates who are within the same block to differentiate themselves from each other. Because the delegate that ultimately does the most for the merger on behalf of a certain block will come to be seen as the more important leader of that block than another delegate who may have had a major role in preparing the working paper, but then did not have the same role in being the public advocate for that block and leading the process of getting a merged document produced. And by the way, I do really want to emphasize that it should not necessarily be the case in a merger that you have exactly one delegate from one coalition negotiating with exactly one delegate from a different coalition. But in absolute fairness, it is very rarely the case that an entire block actually negotiates with an entire other block. Usually a block has by this point realized that there is someone or several someones who have contributed more to the process of creating this working paper and have a better sense of it and are more qualified to advocate for it. And those people will end up being the ones who do the negotiation of the merged document with another block. And again, if you're looking to be an awards contender, you should be one of those people. And if you're expecting to win Best Delegate, you will end up being the person who, after all of this is done, is the clear leader of the new merged document. As I mentioned earlier, when I was giving the example of the block that existed in the committee that I ran at HMUN Boston, there were, as I said, somewhere between 3 and 6 leaders at one point of this one block. But the delegate who ultimately won Best Delegate differentiated themselves. It was a partner committee, so there were 2 people who were representing each country. They differentiated themselves because they ended up being the person who, the 2 people who negotiated mergers on behalf of their block. And as a result of this, their block gave them more trust and put them in a higher position of leadership because the bloc consistently allowed them to negotiate mergers, and they negotiated multiple mergers over the course of the weekend. But it also made it clear to the other blocs that they were negotiating with that the person doing the negotiation was going to be the most important person that they would relate to from the former other bloc. And if that wasn't clear, I'll repeat it differently. If there was one coalition A and another coalition B, the person who is negotiating with coalition B on behalf of coalition A will also be the person that coalition B most looks to get the opinion of coalition A. And the effect is that when the two merge together, that person who is doing the negotiation has the best chance of being the leader of the merged bloc and being the ultimate advocate for the merged draft resolution. And this is a position you want to be in if you're contending for the highest awards in committee. Then, beyond this aspect of committee, an important thing that delegates should be aware of is that the dais cares about the quality of the delegates you work with. I think it is much more impressive if a delegate is able to lead a coalition of delegates who are all well-informed about the topic, all very capable of advocating for the ideas of the draft resolution, and who collectively wage a campaign to win over the committee. You might think intuitively that based on what I've said, we would be most in favor of a leader who most differentiates themselves from the delegates that they're leading, and is by far the best delegate within their bloc. This is not the case. If this is the case, it will be a very rare circumstance that we would be in favor of it. In general, we are most looking for delegates to lead strong other delegates. We will judge the quality of your leadership based on the quality of the people who turn to you for leadership. So those are the two big tips for differentiating yourself from other delegates. Do not interpret this to preclude the fact that we are going to be judging you on the quality of your speeches. We're going to be judging you on your conduct and the degree of both diplomacy and decorum that you exhibited at committee, and your staying on policy. But these two other details, how you handle the merger process and the quality of the team you assemble, are major factors that you might not otherwise consider that impact how the dais will view awards. And just as a final note on awards and how judging at HMUN India works, I emphasized this at different points throughout the process, but I'm going to emphasize it again here because I think this is a very important time to do so. Unmoderated caucus and work outside of formal debate counts a lot at HMUN India. The important thing to us is who most successfully assembles the best possible team of other countries to write the best possible working paper and then later the best possible draft resolution, and then does the best job of advocating for those ideas and is most successful in getting it passed. And only one resolution can pass at HMUN India. 0 resolutions can pass, but the highest number that can pass is 1. These are all, by the way, general rules for the General Assembly, and there are many, many exceptions to all of these rules. But if you're following these rules, you will be doing a lot better than you would be if you didn't know these rules existed. That's about all for me. In terms of next steps, I highly encourage you to think about the kinds of proposals you can make at HMUN India in the General Assembly that can be turned into the clauses of a draft resolution. I think a big pitfall you might fall into is trying to know as much as you can about the topic without thinking about how you instrumentalize that research and turn what you know into what you can propose. Those are very different things. And the former, you're going to get pretty much no credit from the dais for presenting. Because think about it, you're simulating the United Nations. How often does the United Nations ambassador get up and present statistics that are not intended to persuade the committee? Never. What we care about is how successfully you persuade, not how successfully you have researched unless you're using that research to persuade. And with that, that's everything for this presentation. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to email me at disec, D-I-S-E-C, at hmunindia.org. I love responding to delegate questions. There's nothing that makes me happier than talking about the General Assembly. I want you to succeed, and I will answer any question you send my way, even if the answer I can give you is limited to, I'm sorry, I can't answer that. So please, email me. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I hope this was clearer than the webinar with the connection problems. And I look forward to meeting a lot of you at conference.